Welcome back to our video on evidence. We just finished talking about the general questions that you need to ask as a good critical reader in order to evaluate evidence. And now we're going to move to this bubble right here, which is what type of evidence is there and what questions can you ask at each portion. This, again, I think I mentioned in the last video, this whole series of videos is going to leave you with more questions than answers, because asking the question itself will help you determine the overall answer to the question, how good is the evidence? Again, there are some types of evidence that we'll talk about, like testimonials, appeals to authority, analogies, research studies, case examples that are verifiable. So I'll do a few videos about that. And then I'll talk about evidence that you cannot verify. So let's get started with evidence that is verifiable. These are specific types of evidence and specific types of questions to ask. When I talk about expert testimony, sometimes called testimonials, sometimes called appeals to authority, I'm going to give you some examples and then I'm going to give you some questions that you need to ask. Examples look like this. A friend of mine who knows a lot about herbs suggested I take St. John's wort every day. I have been, and it has really helped me sleep at night. So this is a friend who knows a lot about herbs, and the testimony is to take this particular herb, and it seemed to help this person. I have a really mean coworker. I got onto a chat room about dealing with rude people. When I started following the advice I found there, things at work got better. Here's another example of a person who followed the testimony that came through in a chat room. People who were talking about their own experiences about having to deal with rude people. It seemed to help this person when they followed that advice. When I first started nursing my son, my sister, who has breastfed all 5 of her children, gave me some tips. Again, the sister's testimony would be considered the evidence in this argument. Vote for Mr. X for senator. My friend Marcia reads all the major news magazines, and she thinks he has the best foreign policy. Here's another example. I know a woman who works at Walgreens, and she thinks about 80% of the people who get prescriptions for Valium are addicts. All of these are examples of how the evidence would be considered testimony, in some cases expert testimony. So here's the thing to remember. Sometimes testimony is good, sometimes not. How do we know? Here are the questions you need to ask, and these would be the questions that you should write down because you'll need to reflect on them during the practice exercises and during the homework. I've kind of centered these around questions that are a who, about what about the testimony, and why the person is testifying. So here are some who questions, and these are about the authority itself, the testimony giver. Is that person really an expert? Is that person considered an expert by other people? Excuse me. There are also questions about what the testimony is like. For example, is the person talking about the field that they have expertise in or not? Does the person limit his or her own expertise? Sources who clarify what they do and do not know tend to be more trustworthy. This is why my pediatrician gained my trust anytime she said, I don't know what that is. Let me refer you to Dr. So-and-so. That meant that I could really trust when she did know what she was talking about. When people limit their expertise to the field that they are involved in, it tends to be stronger. Another question to ask is, do the others in the field agree or disagree with the expert? Now, it's not something that would necessarily mean, oh, people disagree with you, so you must be wrong. It could be everybody else is wrong. It could be that that particular field has some discrepancies, or they have some disputes within the field. It's just that you need to ask that question. It may tell us something about the expert. There are also questions that you have to ask about the testimony that have to do with why the person is saying it. So, for example, is the expert biased? Now this gets dicey because all of us are biased. I'm biased, you're biased. You have to determine what the bias is based on, and that can then help you determine whether you buy the argument. So for example, I'm biased. I have set up the class to be requiring certain things of you. You, depending on what class you're in, you are either required to watch the news for a lengthy period of time, or you might be required to do service learning projects, or you may be required to do both, depending on what class you're taking. So my testimony has been that this is a good experience for you, or this is worthwhile activity for you in order to gain the competencies of the class. So I'm biased just in the fact that I have told you that. So what is my bias based on? Is it based on my expertise in knowing that skills are learned better when they are practiced in a real setting? Is it bias that coming from the community college mission that when you graduate from the community college, you need to be able to engage civically, globally, locally with your community? Or is it bias based on my own personal political beliefs? You have to ask that question and figure out that answer to determine whether you should buy my argument that these types of activities will help you learn the skills. Hopefully, you are able to understand, based on what I've already told you, that my bias is truly based on what I know about learning skills in context and what our community college mission is. But if you can't figure out my bias, you might not be able to buy my argument. Another question that you need to ask about the expert has to do with why the expert is saying that. In other words, are they getting a payoff for what they testify? Now, that doesn't mean that they aren't getting paid for their time or effort. That's different than getting paid for saying a certain testimony. For example, if I were to have to go into court and testify why I believe that you should be doing service learning, or why I believe you should be engaging in your community and civically in some way, am I getting paid to give that testimony? That's different than if, say, I wrote a book on critical reading and I then gave a public statement talking about how wonderful the book is and how that would be the absolute best way for you to learn critical reading skills. If I give that testimony, I could very definitely get a payoff because people would buy my book. Therefore, I'm getting paid for what I have said, not for the time that I am given as a professional to say my opinion. That's really what you have to ask the question for. There's also a type of evidence that people use called analogies. So when we argue by analogy, this is also something that you can go in and verify. So this is the argument that looks like this. A is to B as C is to D. And it's a way that we attach new information onto old information. In other words, you learn something new by linking it to something you already understand. This is why we have done this since childhood. This is how children learn new things. They attach something they are learning with something they already know. But it's done in argument all the time. So let me give you some examples, and then I'll tell you the question you need to ask. A researcher reports that when rats are confined to an overcrowded cage, they exhibit antisocial behavior. So therefore, my argument is that crime may result from overcrowded conditions like in a city. Get rid of the crowdedness, you'll get rid of the crime. Here's another typical analogy, argument by analogy. Prohibition didn't work in the 1920s. People still found a way to make alcohol and supported a criminal underground network. So I use that to argue this point, that making or keeping drugs illegal today means people will get these drugs from dealers at high prices. That's an argument by analogy. It happens all over our country today. Here's one. Gun control is like trying to reduce drunk driving by making it tougher for sober people to get cars. All of these are argument by analogy, and we ask the same question. It has to do with the assumption. When we argue by analogy, there is an underlying assumption. It's this, that since something is true in one context, it will be true in another. If it was true in the 1920s, for alcohol, it will be true today for illicit drugs. If it was true for cars, it will be true for guns. This is the question to ask. Does the assumption make sense? Is it true that is, is it accurate that is true in this context? Both contexts will be the same. You have to ask, does that assumption really hold? That's the question to ask about analogies. This has been about 11 minutes long, so I'm going to close it here, and the next video will pick up the other types of evidence that can be verified.